Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
We're going to continue our study in Mark, beginning in chapter 2, verse 23, and attempting to go through Mark 3, verse 21. The reason that I had Vernon read the parallel passage in Luke is you're going to see a little bit of difference. A few things are left out, a few things are added in Luke. Now, I've told you over and over again, but the differences in the Gospel, to me, are a sign of their authenticity. The sign of eyewitness accounts instead of just somebody copying the same material. But instead of getting all bogged down in what Matthew says and what Luke says, I'm just going to go through Mark like it is pretty much without comparing it to Matthew and Luke in the different settings, and hope in the years ahead that as we go back and take each gospel separately, that we'll find the will of God in why there are 4 gospels and not just one. Okay? Now, this is the last occurrence in 23 down through 3:6 of the opposition that is begin to come to the forefront between Jesus and the religious authorities and leaders of his day. This particular account, beginning in verse 23, is a reference to Jesus walking through the grain fields. Now, it doesn't say when, it just says on a Sabbath he was passing through the fields. This word for passing through is a Greek word that means the little footpaths that go through the fields in that part of the world. Now, of course, they had certain paths that they walked down to help fertilize it, help take the seed to certain spots. So these are footpaths through the fields. And notice it says wheat fields in my translation. It probably has corn in King James, is it not? Have corn? Well, now, it's not what we think of corn, because corn in 1611 meant any kind of grain or cereal. So what we have here is some kind of cereal crop. Whether it's wheat or barley or oats, we don't know exactly what it is. But apparently the heads were ripe, and they were falling over the footpath, and the guys would have had to kind of push them out of the way as they go by. Now, his disciples were, as they were walking through this, apparently the Pharisees were following Jesus. And you can almost see the picture in your mind as Jesus and his band of disciples, as well as a great multitude, were walking down this little path. And the Pharisees are behind them trying to peek, see what they're doing up front, waiting to do something they could accuse Jesus' disciples are, because they're following him now everywhere he went. These scribes and Pharisees and those kind of people. Now you see what it says in verse 24. So the Pharisees were saying to him, that is an imperfect tense, which means continuous action in past time. It wasn't at one time they came up and said, "Why are you doing this?" The implication is, as they were walking back behind them someplace, spying on them, they kept hollering up to the front, "Why are you letting them do that? Why are you letting them do that? Why are you letting them do that?" And over and over and over again, these Pharisees were throwing this charge at Jesus because of what his disciples were doing. Now, Jesus was not doing this. And I think it's so he could speak to what these disciples were doing. Now, you see where it says, "Just look. What they are doing on the Sabbath is against the law to do." Now, in Exodus 34:21, it says that reaping, harvesting, willowing is not allowed on the Sabbath. Now, in Deuteronomy 23:25, it does allow for men, as they walk through these fields of grain, to pull some of the things off and eat them, rub them in their hands, blow the shaft away, and eat the grain. That was allowed. But the problem was not they were pulling the grain, but they were pulling it on the Sabbath. Now, when Vernon read Luke, it said they were rubbing the grain between their hands. They were picking the heads, rubbing the grain, blowing the shaft away, and eating that raw grain. Now, that broke 3 Sabbath violations. That is included, it is called harvesting, willowing, and preparing food. And all 3 were against the rabbinical traditions to be done on the Sabbath. So what the disciples were doing was breaking the Sabbath regulation. Now, the Jews had developed, because they were so afraid, it was done in a good motive. They were so afraid they might, in accident, in an inadvertent way, might break one of the Old Testament laws, that they built around the Old Testament a huge system of oral tradition. And this oral tradition told them every detail of life to follow. And they followed this oral tradition so they wouldn't break the commandments of the Old Testament. But Jesus knew that the oral tradition had become a heavy burden on the people. Jesus never broke the Old Testament. Jesus never went against the Mosaic law. But Jesus, time and time again, went against this oral ceremonial law, and that's exactly what he does here. Now notice, if you will, in verse 25, he answers them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his soldiers were in need and hungry?" Now this question is like I showed you last week. This question is that unique construction in Greek that demands an affirmative answer. He wasn't asking them, "Haven't you ever read?" He was saying, "You guys know the law. You guys have read the Old Testament. You know that David went in." Now, what did David do? David was fleeing from Saul. David was hungry. He had some men with him. How many we don't know. And he went to a town called Nod, or Nob, it's spelled both ways. And that is where the tabernacle of the Lord. Now it says the house of the Lord here, down in verse 26. But the house of the Lord is not the temple, it's the tabernacle, the tent, when it was at Nod, not in Jerusalem. So he stopped there, and the high priest, now you see when it says, my translation has Abiathar, or something like that. If you go back at 1 Samuel 21, 1 and following, you'll find that the priest was not Abiathar, but Elimelech. Now, does this mean the Bible is wrong? We have an obvious contradiction between Mark and Samuel. Now, Luke, as you remember, left this priest's name out altogether. If you'll go back, and please write this down next to this man's name, because this is one of the examples of contradictions that people say in the Bible that really aren't contradictions at all. In 2 Samuel 8:17, in 1 Chronicles 18:16, and 24:6, Elimelech is said to be the son of Abiathar. But in 1 Samuel 21 and 22, Abiathar is said to be the son of Elimelech. Now what we have here is a confusion in the Old Testament, not an error in Mark. Now there's several possibilities. Both of these men may have been at Nod, and maybe one of them died very soon after that, and the other became the high priest. Maybe the father named his son, and the son named his son after his father. May have been a possibility. Whatever the problem is here, I want to say to you that my view of the Bible is that God just doesn't make mistakes when He spoke to these men about writing down the Scriptures. And so, even though we may not understand why there's a different name in Mark than back in 1 Samuel, I want to say there is an obvious reason, and I refuse to let Mark have an error in him, because that just goes totally against my view of inspiration. So, whatever the compromise may be, whether it's a problem of son and father in the Old Testament, or father and son being so closely identified with the high priesthood that they were both called high priests, I don't know. But I think that Mark here is accurate in his use of this word. Now, you see where it says, and the sacred loaves. Now, these sacred loaves are mentioned in Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 9, and the priests are the only ones who are to eat these loaves. These loaves are called showbread, and they are 12 loaves that are placed every week on a special table in the holy place before the Holy of Holies inside the temple or the tabernacle. Now, this table of showbread is described in Exodus 25, verses 23 through 28. It was so many cubits tall, so many cubits wide, so many cubits long. It was covered with gold. It was made of acacia wood. It was carried by certain poles, and so it's very descriptive. Now, these loaves were not your regular Mrs. Baird's loaves. These loaves weighed 6.5 pounds apiece. That's some submarine sandwich. So it would have fed 12 of these things as a whole bunch of bread. It would have fed quite a few fellows. So David and his men ate these loaves that supposedly the priests were only supposed to eat. And Jesus says, even your scriptures say that men's need are more important than ritual regulations. That's what he's homing in on. So these big old pounds of loaves are what David ate. Now, which it is against the law for anyone except the priest to eat. And that's Leviticus 24, 5 through 9. Now notice in verse 27 it says, and he said to them, imperfect, He kept saying to them. They kept asking, He kept telling them. They kept asking, He kept telling them. Jesus kept saying to them, the Sabbath was made to serve man and not man to keep the Sabbath. We've got to realize that God did not give man a day of rest to burden man down. God appointed a day of rest to recreate man, to build man up. And any legal restrictions that we may place on man that tends to pull him down, we've got to realize it's God's will to build men up. So man was not made to serve God's regulations, but God's regulations were made to serve man. And we've got to remember that. This church does not exist in and of itself. This church only exists to serve men. The day this church starts walking on people to meet the aim of the institution is the day this church has ceased to be a part of the body of Christ. One person is always more important than any man-made institution. One person. Now, notice it says that, so the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. Now, this word Son of Man, if you look back at chapter 2, verse 10, I went over this with you. And I think the emphasis here is on the fact of the humanity of Jesus with the subtle implication, though it's not implicit, of His divinity. Because you see, this term was used by Him as a veiled reference to His Messiahship, because the people of His day had an inordinate nationalistic implications to their understanding of Messiah. So it was a veiled reference, not very specific. You see where it says that He is Lord of the Sabbath? Jesus was saying about Himself, as He had called Himself the new wine, as He had called Himself the great physician, now He's saying, I am Lord of the Sabbath. What He was saying was, I am master, owner, ruler of the Sabbath. Jesus is saying something very, very significant about His own person. In a veiled sense, He is saying, I am God. For only God is master of the Sabbath. So we end this section here, and we go to the next section. The next section deals, the point of time is not told. It must be somewhere in Galilee. We don't know where. Maybe Capernaum, may not be. He entered into a synagogue again. Now, the reason he went to a synagogue over and over and over again, this was his characteristic method on the Sabbath for preaching. Wherever he was, he went into the synagogue, because they would always let the visiting rabbi teach, and it was his way to speak to those who were the most dedicated to the Scriptures and to the love of God. They would certainly be in the synagogue, and so he went there as Paul did. It was his method. Now, there was a man who had a withered hand. Now, the Gospel of Hebrews, which is an apocryphal gospel, of which we have only fragments, says that this man was a mason and that he had hurt his hand some way in his work, and he had come to beg Jesus to restore his right hand. Now, Mark doesn't say it is his right hand, but Luke 6:6 says it was his right hand. So, he had a withered hand. Now, the tense of the verb here, withered hand, is a perfect participle, which means he wasn't born with a withered hand, but in some accident or in some disease, his hand had become impotent. He couldn't use it. And so he wasn't born that way, but it had become that way through the years. And he couldn't work. Now, notice that they kept closely watching him in verse 2. This is the same scribes and Pharisees that has been dogging his heels now since chapter 2, looking for any excuse to accuse him, any excuse to bring him to trial, any excuse to discredit him. They were always there. They were right in the front, and they were throwing things in his face like, why do you do this? Why do you do this? Why do you do this? And they were there. And they saw this man with a withered hand also. And they were wondering if he would cure him. So in verse 3, Jesus says to the man with the withered hand, get up in the crowd. This is an imperative. He commands me. He didn't say, please get up if you would. He says, get up and stand in the middle. So this guy stands up in church. It's like somebody standing on the middle pew there and just standing up in the church. Everybody could see him, okay? And Jesus turns to these scribes and Pharisees in verse 4 and says to them, is it right to do people good on the Sabbath or to do them evil? To save life or to take it? I need to stop there for a moment and describe to you the rabbinical teachings about healing on the Sabbath. The rabbis would allow for some healing on the Sabbath, but only healing in the case of a dire emergency where the man or woman or animal's life was in jeopardy of being lost if something wasn't done. And what you could do was not heal the situation, but you could do just enough to keep the situation stable until the next day. If you cut your finger, you could put white gauze, but you couldn't put ointment on it. If, say, a wall fell on somebody, you could take the wall up to see if they were alive. If they were alive, you could help them. If they were dead, you had to leave them till the next day. So it was an understanding of rabbinical Judaism that you could not help someone get better, but you could stabilize their condition. Now Jesus says to them, this is all oral tradition that's built up after the Old Testament. He says, is it right to do good or to evil? Well, they had a real problem. They don't know how to answer him. And then this little phrase, to save life or to take it. Now this man with a withered hand, it wasn't a matter of saving his life. He'd have had a withered hand the next day. So why did Jesus add to save life or to take it? Well, down in verse 6, these Pharisees get so mad, they storm out of the service, and they begin to plot to kill him. Now, isn't it the epitome of human ignorance that these men would say, no, don't heal this guy with withered hands, against the law. But it's not against the law to go out and to conspire the death of someone. Premeditated murder is all right. But don't heal the guy with a withered hand. You catch the picture of their mentality? Legalism. Point of rules. So Jesus begins to talk to them in such a way, and he says, but they had nothing to say, imperative. Continuous action in past time. Friends, it was quiet for a long time. He asked them this question, and he looked around the room and waited for an answer. You almost start fidgeting when you do that, don't you? Quiet. What's the matter? We don't believe in quietness in Baptist worship services. Everybody gets nervous when it gets quiet. Rabbis did too. As he looked around, they started fidgeting more and more. Just really got nervous, hot under the collar. Well, then Jesus looked around at them in what? Love, pity, mercy, grace. What did he look at them with? Jesus got mad? I can't believe it. What happened to 1 Corinthians 13? Friends, we have misunderstood the whole concept of anger in the New Testament. There are several words in Greek for anger. There's a word here, it's the word arge. It means a settled opposition to something. It's God's attitude toward sin. God has a settled hatred of sin. God is always angry at sin. That's the nature of God, to be angry at sin. Now, He loves men, but He hates their sin. There's other kinds of anger. Anger that seems to rise up in a moment and then is gone. We would call it rage. You ever see somebody get so mad their face turns solid red, but it's gone very quickly? That's another Greek word for anger, but it's not used here. It's a settled opposition. Jesus looked at them, and He became mad because of their stubbornness of mind. You see where it says, because He was pained or grieved, present tense, He continued to be grieved with them over their stubbornness of mind. This word means an unwillingness to see the truth. It's the guy who tells you he knows something, and you just say, well, here it is right here. And he'll say, don't confuse me with the facts. I know that's so. Now that's where these Pharisees were. They were blind, and they liked their blindness, and they weren't about to see the light, and they didn't want to hear the truth, and I know everything I want to know, thank you. And it just really made Jesus mad that they were so stubborn and stiff-necked and hard-hearted and wouldn't see the truth. It was right there. He's going to heal the man, and they wouldn't even see it. Now, so he turned to the man and said, hold out your hand. And the man holds out his hand. Now, mine has cured. The Greek word is restored, meaning it's restored as it was before the accident or disease that crippled him. The very act of him holding out his crippled hand. You know how people would be very uptight standing up in the middle of worship service and holding out their deformity. And the very act of holding out that hand, his faith is shown and it's made whole. I mean, right there. I mean, just, there it is. And you think those men saw the truth and responded? No. They went out in a rage. Now, Mark in verse 6 doesn't say they went out in a rage. It just said they went out. But Luke 6:11 says they went out in a rage. Friends, if they had had a thermometer in their mouth, that would have broke the end off of it. They were hot. 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 They were so hot, they went and consulted with a group of men that normally they wouldn't be caught dead with. And that was the Herodians. Now the Herodians are those who support the reign of the Herod dynasty. They were court workers with Herod, government officials, local government officials. And they had a lot of hobnobbing to do with the Romans because they were the ones to keep the status quo. A Pharisee wouldn't be caught dead in the Herodian's house. Wouldn't be caught dead talking to one on the street. But these guys are so mad that they went out and plotted with the Herodians to put Jesus to death. Now, it may have been they went to the Herodians because the Pharisees had power in the Jerusalem, Judea area. They were authority there. But up in Galilee, they didn't have much power. It may be they went to the Herodians because the Herodians had power in Galilee as well. So it may have been a political kind of alliance to get something done about this Jesus. We've got to stop him healing these people. We've got to stop him raising the dead. He's causing all kind of trouble for us. He's going against our orthodoxy. We can't have it. Okay? Now, notice if you would, when it says in verse 7, so Jesus retired with his disciples to the sea, and a vast throng of people followed him. And there's a list of places. Now follow me in yours, and I want to... Galilee, of course, is from around the lake of where his headquarters are now. Judea and Jerusalem is about 100 miles south. So these folks walked 100 miles to hear Jesus. 100 miles. But even further than Jerusalem was the next little word. Mine has Idumea, which is the kingdom of Edom, which is south of Judea. So they have walked 200 miles plus to hear Jesus. And then we have the other side of Jordan, which in the Bible is called Perea, modern Jordan. And then the neighborhood of Tyre and Sidon. This is the whole sea coast, the Philistines area. Phoenicia, okay? And this vast throng, they kept hearing of the great thing. It's the present participle. It was the talk all over that part of the world. Have you heard about Jesus of Nazareth? Have you heard about Jesus? Have you heard about Jesus? He healed the blind. He healed my uncle. He healed my cousin. He raised my aunt from the dead. Have you heard about Jesus? And man, it was like the whole countryside was flocking after you. I don't know how many thousands of people were following him around. But thousands had come to him to be healed that were sick. You can just see the picture. The crippled coming and the lepers coming, the blind coming, all kinds of diseases were following Jesus. And they were coming sick and they were going away whole. And it was something to see. And yes, a vast throng of people kept hearing of the great things that he was doing, present tense, continual, habitual action. He continually healed them. He continually taught them. He continually made them whole. And so he told the disciples to keep a little boat ready for him at all times to prevent the crowd from crushing him. It's a little rowboat. She put behind a big fishing boat in case the motor gives out. Now, this is a very good lesson for us. Jesus was a very practical man. He was a man that had forethought. Now, with his miraculous powers, he could have built a wall about himself. He could have used his miracle-working divine nature to stop the crowd from crushing him. But he was a man who didn't mind taking precautions in life. And he told his disciples, keep a boat just offshore. And as I walk down the lake of Galilee, you row along the shore. And everywhere I go by that lake, you follow me with that rowboat. And if there ever gets a time that crowds are pushing too much, you dock the rowboat and I'll get in. We have an account of him doing that very thing. The press of the crowd, he got out in Peter's boat. Now that says to me something. That says to me that we need to take a little forethought in life. If Jesus had enough forethought to think about something like that, we don't have to be ashamed about taking a little forethought with our actions. Jesus was a practical man. And there was old Peter, I imagine, out there rowing that rowboat, following Jesus around the lake. Now, verse 10. For he cured so many people that all who had ailments kept crowding up against him. The Greek word here is falling against him. Friends, these folks were so excited about the possibility of having release from their ailments that they didn't wait for Jesus to touch them. They were grabbing at him, pushing up against him, trying to touch the hem of his garment, trying to touch his back, just trying to touch him. It's a mob scene, folks. Can you imagine people trying to push in the crowd who were blind just to touch him? They're touching everybody to see if they'll touch him. Well, it was some kind of scene. They were just crushing in on him, okay? Now, verse 11. Whenever the foul spirits saw him, they fell down before him and screamed. Can't you get this picture in your mind? Thousands of people all around here trying to touch Jesus, and all these who had demons. Now, it's kind of like, if you ever watched the Macy's parade on TV, you couldn't fall down in that crowd. You could pass out and you'd be there 3 hours. Not enough room to fall down, you know. I don't know how these demon-possessed folks ever got in the ground, but they must have pushed folks out of the way to fall down. But they fell down. Now, it's very interesting to me. The word for foul spirits in my translation is the spirit, the unclean. And that speaks about whatever a spirit is, I don't know, as far as it a fallen angel or whatever. I think it's the fallen angels, is my understanding of demons. King James, when it uses the word devils, is not real good. There's two different words in Greek. One means devils and one means demons. And the words here is demons, not devils. There's only one devil, only one Satan, but he has a lot of henchmen. Now, so they fell down and began screaming. Now, the falling down is imperfect, and the screaming is imperfect. It means, man, there were folks falling down and screaming all over the place. Just all through the crowd, folks were falling down screaming. And it kept on happening hour after day after day. These things were going on. It must have been the most hectic mob you could ever imagine. And Jesus really had no time to teach them at all. Now notice they said, you are the Son of God. Now why would they say that? Well, number one, they may have known the problems that would have caused Jesus if the people would have thought that he was the promised Messiah from the Old Testament. For they had a nationalistic image about what he would do. It may also be a very smart move on these demons' part, because it's not too many more verses until Jesus is going to be accused of being in cahoots with Beelzebub or Satan. And if these demons are falling down and witnessing to him, it adds to the proof that he's not of God, but he's in cahoots with Satan. And so it may have been they were trying the reverse psychology on the crowd. But every time they fell down, every time they screamed, the imperfect tense says, and Jesus charged them, really the word is rebuked sternly, over and over again, and wouldn't let any of them speak. Really he's saying, shut up. Okay? Now, verse 13. And then he went to the mountain. Now, mine has hillside. There's no real mountains around this part of the country. We're talking about a hill country, hillside. So the Sermon on the Mount, really the Sermon on the Hill. Of course, to us out here, the overpass is a mountain. So I don't know, maybe mountain to us, you know. Now, and he summoned to him those whom he wanted, and they went with him. Now, Luke tells us, Luke 6:12 says that he prayed all night before he made his decision. Mark doesn't say that, but Luke says he prayed all night before he chose the 12. And he says in verse 14, he appointed the 12. Now the 12 should be capitalized. It's the title of the group, the inner core group. Now why do you think he chose 12? It's obvious to me that the symbolism of choosing 12 is a symbolism of the new Israel. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons of Joseph, 12 apostles. It's a symbolism of the new Israel, if you please. And then he gave them the title apostles. Now the word apostles means the ones sent, the sent ones. Now he chose them for three basic, specific reasons. Number one is found in verse 14. He chose them that they might be with him. That was very important. He chose them that they might be with him and learn from him personally. There was no books. The only way you could teach somebody was to write on the hearts of men. And Jesus wanted these men following him day after day that he could write his message on their hearts. Now, all 12 did not follow him all the time. Some came and some went back home. But some were there all the time with him. The second reason is to send them forth to preach. The word to send forth is the same verb form as the word apostles. To be with him and to proclaim the message with him. He called them to be with him and to preach the message he was preaching. And number three, to have the right to drive out demons. Now the word right, King James has the word power. It's not a good translation. It's not the word dunamis. It's the word exousia, which means right or authority or power. So he gave them the right, the legal authority, the legal power, if you please, to drive out demons. Now here's the word. King James has the word devils. No such thing as devils. It's demons. Totally different Greek word than the word for devil. Now, The 12 who he appointed were. Now I want you to get your list here, and I'm going to give you some very significant things of these men. And you write this down in your list and keep this with you, okay? Because these lists get very confusing. There is 4 lists in the Gospels and 1 in Acts of the 12 apostles. Every list is different. Peter starts every list, and Judas Iscariot ends every list, but inside the list there is variations. But if you will divide the list into 4s, the 3 in every group of 4 are always in that group. Excuse me, maybe 3 groups. Let me read here. Forgot which one it is. Okay, if you divide it into 3 groups of 4 each, inside the groups of 4, the names are always the same, though they change in the order inside their group of 4. Okay? 3 groups of 4, always together. Now, here they go. Number 1, Peter. Now, the word Peter is the Greek word for rock. But please put, after you put Greek word rock, put in parentheses detached. There are 2 words in Greek for rock, bedrock and a detached boulder. And Peter is Aramaic word Cephas, which means a detached rock, a boulder, not bedrock. Now, the name Simon is a Hebrew name for an obeyer. O-B-E-Y-E-R, an obeyer. So, Jesus changed his name from an obeyer to a rock. I think you might see the significance there if you read much about Peter. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, James' brother. These 2 boys are middle class, upper middle class. They're rich folks. These ain't peasant fishermen with no shoes. These folks had a large fishing business that their daddy ran, Zebedee. And so they're upper middle class fishing. They're no dummies. They're no peons. These are upper middle class businessmen of the day. Okay? Now, he calls them, and he named them Boanerges, which is Aramaic for sons of thunder. And many of us think it goes back to Luke chapter 9, verse 54, where this city wouldn't respond to God's message. And so James and John got outside of town and said, "Hey, Jesus, why don't you call down fire and burn the place up?" Yay, sock it to them. Jesus said, "Golly, you are something else." And so they got the name the Sons of Thunder from their great love for people. Burn the town down. Well, verse 18, Andrew. Now, Andrew is a Greek name, and it means manly. Manly, okay? Andrew is one of the most beautiful people in all the New Testament. He's the one who brought Peter to the Lord, and Peter became the inner circle, but it never says that Andrew was jealous. Andrew is the one who brought the little baby that had the 5 loaves and fishes to Jesus. Andrew's a beautiful man. Philip is a Greek word that means fond of horses. Little word to mean all that. Philip means fond of horses. Bartholomew means the son of Ptolemy. Now, the Ptolemies were the rulers of Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest. So this is a strange name. Bartholomew means the son of Ptolemy. He's also called Nathaniel. John 1:45. Nathaniel and Bartholomew are the same person. Matthew in Hebrew means gift of, and the implication is gift of Yahweh. So Matthew is the Levi that's mentioned just a couple of chapters before. Matthew and Levi are the same. Thomas is a Hebrew word that means twin. The Greek form of this is often mentioned in the Bible too. It's the word Didymus. Didymus and Thomas are the same. And then we have James, the son of Alphaeus. He's also called Jacob. And in Mark 15:40, he's called James the Less. Now, some think James the Less means James the Lesser in comparison to James, the brother of John. But some think that he's called James the Less because he was a short, squatty fellow. There's hope yet. Then we have Thaddeus. Thaddeus goes by 2 other names. He goes by Lebbeus in Matthew 10:3, and in some manuscripts of Mark, right here. He's also called Judas in John 14:22. So it's Lebbeus, Thaddeus, or Judas. Now, then we have Simon the Zealot. The word zealot that's translated zealot here is really an Aramaic term, Canaanian. And Canaan was the name of the political patriotic party that we call the Zealots. This was the kind of guy, he would have been one of the Minutemen in our revolution. He was a guy who was against the government and would die for the overthrow of the Roman Empire. Okay? He hated the Romans, boy. He was a zealot, political activist. Now, Judas Iscariot. There's two possibilities of the word Iscariot. Some think it means man of Kirios, and that name's in your book, I think. I put it, Kirios, that's a town. It's mentioned in Joshua 15:23. But some think this word Iscarii can mean a little dagger that's worn in the belt. And it was a dagger, that those long flowing robes, these assassins, these zealots, would hide the daggers in their coats, kind of like Judas and Brutus and Julius Caesar. And they would whip these daggers out and slice Romans whenever they got a chance. It may have been that Judas was a dagger man, or it may have been that Judas was simply a man from the city of Kirios. Okay. I'm almost through. Let me go ahead and finish this last little deal. Now, notice it says that he went home, and again the crowds gathered so that it was impossible for them even to take meals. Now, I want you to pick this frantic, frenzied time. Demons falling down all over the place. Crippled people and people blind and people with leprosy and people with, blood, issues of blood and people with sick daughters and people carrying their babies and everybody trying to touch Jesus and push in. And, if you had a sick baby, how hard would you try to get to Jesus? Just think, if your daughter, little girl, little boy was sick, how hard would you push? How much would you scream? And how many folks would you climb over to get that baby to someone who could heal him? Friends, it was a madhouse. And it was such a frenzied madhouse that Jesus didn't even have time to eat. They were falling against him and touching his clothes, and really a mob scene. Now, in verse 21, his kinsmen heard of it and came over to get hold of him, for they kept saying he's gone crazy. Now, his kinsman is translated many ways. There's some translations here who have his friends. There's some who have his relatives. There's some who have his family. Now, the word here, the literal word in Greek, is those from his side. Now, that might mean family. It's used that way several times. It might mean close friends. It just really doesn't, it's just not specific enough. It's those from his side heard about. Now, you see the heard of it, the of it's not in Greek. They heard, but what they heard is not specified. Maybe they heard about the mob scene. Maybe they heard he couldn't eat. Maybe they heard he had no place to sleep. Maybe they heard that thousands were following him around and the screaming kind of things that were going on. Anyway, they heard and came over to get hold of him. Now, a little phrase, get hold of him, means to take control of. Friends, they came to take him by force home. Protective custody, if you please. They were going to drag him bodily back home. And his relatives are mentioned a little bit later, so I think probably that's who we're talking about. In Matthew 10:36, Jesus said, you're going to have problems, even in your own family, if you're committed to me. So his own family seems to really have been after him here. They thought he had really lost his mind. Okay, is there any questions or comments about this section of Mark? I must have explained it so well, there's no questions, right? I doubt that. You all afraid to talk, are you? Any questions? One more time. Comments or questions? Yes. Yes. Excuse me? The title Son of God? We don't know. It never says exactly why, but Jesus wouldn't let him talk. The title Son of God is a much more messianic title than the title Son of Man used back up in 28. So by them saying you're the Son of God, the implication is there, you're the Messiah. Now the word Son of God was used of the angels in a plural sense in the Old Testament, used of Israel in a singular sense in the Old Testament. But it can kind of mean a unique relationship to God or the Messiah. So what they were saying is, this guy's the Messiah. And by saying that, either one, number one, they would have brought these nationalistic implications to that name, to the Jewish mind, and they would have tried to make him king, which they did one time, remember? He fed him, they tried to make him king. And he didn't have this political understanding, so he didn't want to be called the Messiah yet. Number two, since they're going to accuse him of being in cahoots with the devil, if these demons would have been testifying to him, it would have added evidence to the fact that he really was working for the devil if the demons are witnessing to him, you see. And so it may have been their way of trying to convince the people that, hey, this guy really is of the devil, not of God. And I think possibly number 3 is, when these demons spoke about, most time here I think it's a Son of God, not the Son of God, and they were taking away from his uniqueness in a sense also. You see, that's what the little slave girl said about a way of salvation when Paul healed her in Acts. So that kind of thing's involved, Claudia. Exactly what it is, we just don't know. But he wouldn't let them talk. He really shut them up, and not many of them were able to say that. So, yeah. Right. Exodus 34:21. That's just the Old Testament admonition against work on the Sabbath, like harvesting, willowing, and reaping, and all that. Right. And then Deuteronomy 23:25 is the part in the law that says you can pull the tops off and eat them on any other day of the Sabbath. Yes, Rex. Yeah, his disciples included across the social spectrum, clear across it. It'd be like a liberal Democrat being best friends with a conservative Republican during an election year. But see, Matthew worked for the Herodians. See, he worked for Herod, so he'd have known him.